The neon sign flickered in the night, casting an eerie glow over the wet asphalt. "Sunset Inn," it read, though there was no sun, only the oppressive weight of a storm rolling in. The wind howled, making the skeletal trees surrounding the motel sway and creak. Claire squinted through the windshield of her car, trying to make out the edges of the motel in the downpour. Her GPS had gone haywire miles back, and her phone was dead. She had no choice but to stop. As she parked, the old building loomed larger than it should, its faded paint and broken shutters giving it an air of abandonment. But the vacancy light was on, a dull red glow. Claire grabbed her duffel bag and hurried through the rain to the office. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and a small bell jingled. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of mildew and something far more rotten. A man sat behind the counter, watching an old black and white TV with the volume turned down. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, yet he greeted her with an unnervingly wide grin. "Room for one?" he rasped. Claire nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She felt uneasy, but exhaustion overpowered her instincts. It had been a long drive, and all she wanted was a bed. The man handed her an old-fashioned key attached to a heavy brass tag. "Room 9, just down the hall." He didn't ask for her name, didn't even glance at her driver's license. As she turned to leave, his grin widened even more. "Don't worry about the noise," he added cryptically. Claire frowned but didn't respond. She just wanted to get to her room. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with peeling floral wallpaper, and each door she passed seemed more decrepit than the last. Room 9 sat at the far end, its door slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for her. When she stepped inside, she was greeted by the stale odor of damp carpet and something metallic like rust or old blood. The bedspread was an ugly shade of brown, and the TV looked like it hadn't worked in decades. But it was quiet, aside from the relentless tapping of rain on the window. She closed the door behind her, hearing the lock click into place, and dropped her bag onto the bed. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and she wrapped her jacket tighter around herself. As she unpacked, she heard it, the noise the man had warned her about. At first it was faint, like distant footsteps in the hall, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Someone or something was walking just outside her door. The slow, deliberate steps made her heart race. She glanced at the peephole, but it was too dark to see anything. The footsteps stopped. She waited, her breath held, ears straining. A soft scratching sound started, like fingernails lightly scraping against wood. It was right outside her door, gentle at first, but then it grew more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to get in. Claire backed away, her hands shaking. She grabbed her phone, but the screen remained stubbornly black. Dead, just like the rest of the place. The scratching stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even worse. She stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the next sound. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the room. She gasped, stumbling back into the bed. Who could it be at this hour? She didn't dare approach the door. Instead, she remained still, listening. The knocking came again, louder this time, and more insistent. But she didn't move. Suddenly, the knob jiggled. Once, twice. Then it turned, but the door didn't open. The lock was holding. Claire could see the brass handle twisting back and forth as whoever was on the other side tried to force their way in. Panic surged through her. She backed up farther, her eyes darting around the room for anything she could use to defend herself. But the room was sparse, with only the bed, a small table, and a chair. The knob stopped moving, but she didn't feel any relief. A moment later, a low, guttural whisper came from the other side of the door. "Claire?" Her blood ran cold. How did they know her name? She bolted for the window, desperate for an escape, but as she yanked back the heavy curtains, her heart sank. The window was sealed shut, the glass fogged and cracked. No way out, her mind raced. Maybe she was imagining things, maybe it was just some strange coincidence. But that voice, it had sounded familiar. Then the phone rang. The old rotary phone on the bedside table crackled to life, its shrill ring cutting through the tension. Claire stared at it, her hands trembling. She didn't want to answer, but she knew she had to. Slowly, she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no reply, only static at first, then the same voice, deeper this time, almost distorted. "Claire, room 9. She slammed the phone down, her pulse racing. Whoever this was, they were playing with her. She ran to the door, pressed her ear against it, and listened. Silence. The hallway was dead. She considered bolting, leaving everything behind and making a run for her car, but something held her back. It was as if the room itself didn't want her to leave. Suddenly, the TV flickered on by itself, the screen flashing white noise. Claire jumped, her eyes darting toward it. Through the static, she could barely make out an image. A dark figure standing at the end of a long hallway. The hallway looked just like the one outside her room. Her stomach churned. She reached for the remote, but it wasn't working. The figure on the screen began to move, slowly walking down the hallway toward the camera. It was heading straight for her room. Her breath quickened as she stared, paralyzed by fear. The figure grew closer, its form shadowy and indistinct, but there was something horribly familiar about it. It stopped just outside the door. The TV flickered again, and the screen went black. Claire's heart pounded in her ears. She backed away from the door, inching toward the bathroom. Maybe she could lock herself in there until morning. Maybe this was all just some twisted dream. But as she turned toward the bathroom, her blood froze. The bathroom door was already open, and inside, a figure stood in the dark, its face shrouded in shadow. It was watching her. Claire screamed, but no sound escaped her throat. She stumbled backward, her legs barely holding her up as the figure took a step forward, its features slowly coming into focus. It was her. A twisted, grotesque version of herself, eyes sunken and lifeless, skin pale and bloated. "Leave," the doppelganger whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her own. Before it's too late. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, wrenching it open with trembling hands. The hallway was empty, but she didn't stop to look. She ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence, down the corridor and into the storm. The man at the front desk was gone, the office dark and abandoned. She didn't care. She ran to her car, fumbling with her keys in the rain, finally getting the door open. As she sped away from the motel, she glanced in the rearview mirror, heart still racing. The Sunset Inn stood silent and still, swallowed by the night. But in the window of room 9, she saw a figure standing motionless, watching her leave. Its face was hers. Claire didn't stop driving until the sun rose, but even in the daylight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't really left. Not all of her. Something had stayed behind in that cursed motel, waiting for the next lost soul to arrive. The rain fell in sheets, drumming relentlessly on the roof of Adam's car. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, squinting into the darkness. He'd been driving for hours, lost on back roads after missing the last highway turnoff. His phone had lost signal miles ago, and now all he could see were trees, their branches bending low under the weight of the storm. Just when the anxiety began to claw at him, a flickering light appeared through the rain. A motel. It wasn't much, a small, squat building with a faded sign that read Green Hollow Inn. The vacancy light buzzed weakly, casting a dull glow onto the empty parking lot. Adam hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to keep driving, but the exhaustion weighed heavier than the unease. He needed sleep. He pulled into the lot, parked near the front office, and stepped out into the downpour. His jacket did little to shield him from the cold rain as he jogged toward the entrance. The door creaked open and a small bell jingled overhead. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent light. It smelled of dust and stale air. Behind the counter stood a woman. She was old, with a hunched back and gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, with deep-set eyes that didn't seem to blink. She smiled when Adam walked in, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice a soft rasp. Adam nodded, shifting uncomfortably. There was something off about her, something he couldn't quite place, but he brushed it aside. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was a bed. He handed over some cash, and she slid a rusted key across the counter toward him. "Room 3, she said, still smiling. "Enjoy your stay, and try not to leave after dark." He frowned. "Excuse me?" The woman's smile faltered. "The storm is bad," she said quickly. "It's easy to get lost out there." Adam nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, but he thanked her and took the key. He headed back out into the rain, finding room 3 just a few doors down. The door groaned as he unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he'd expected, dated, with faded wallpaper and a musty smell. The bedspread was a hideous orange, worn thin in places. There was a small TV in the corner, but it looked ancient. He set his bag on the floor and sighed, collapsing onto the bed. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do. As the rain battered the window, he began to drift off to sleep, his body sinking into the old mattress. A sudden noise jolted him awake. At first, he thought it was the storm, maybe a tree branch scraping against the window, but then he heard it again. A faint whisper. He sat up, listening intently, his heart beginning to race. The whisper was soft, but it was there. Faint words he couldn't quite make out. "Help me." He froze. The sound seemed to be coming from the closet. His eyes flicked toward it. The door was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness visible inside. He stared at it, his pulse quickening. Maybe it was just his imagination, a trick of the wind and his exhaustion. But then the whisper came again. Louder this time, desperate. "Help me, please." A cold chill ran down Adam's spine. He stood slowly, his legs shaking, and approached the closet. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to leave, to get out of this place. But something compelled him forward. He yanked the door open. The closet was empty. Just an old, rusted coat hanger swinging slightly from the rail as if it had been disturbed moments before. He stared into the darkness, breathing heavily, trying to calm his racing heart. There was nothing there. He was imagining things. He shut the closet door and backed away. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling himself it was just the storm. He crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over himself, though sleep felt impossible now. A loud bang echoed from the wall behind him, followed by another. It sounded like someone was hammering on the wall from the next room. Adam sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened as the banging continued, growing louder and more erratic, as if someone was trying to break through the wall. "Hey!" he shouted, banging on the wall in return. "Cut it out!" The noise stopped. The silence that followed was unnerving, too sudden, too complete. Adam sat in the darkness, waiting, listening. But the room remained still. Then, just as he was about to lie back down, he heard it again. The whisper. This time it was right next to him. "Please, help me." Adam jumped out of bed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whisper wasn't coming from the closet this time. It was coming from the wall. He pressed his ear against it, listening. There was movement, soft shuffling like someone or something was inside the wall. He pulled back, his mind racing. What was going on? He grabbed his phone, desperate to call for help, but there was still no signal. He glanced around the room, his panic rising. He had to get out. Something was wrong here, something terribly wrong. As he moved toward the door, there was a knock. A single, sharp rap on the wood that made him freeze in place. Slowly, he turned the knob and opened it just a crack. No one was there. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stepped out into the rain. The parking lot was empty, the office dark. The storm raged on, but the world felt strangely still, as if something was watching him from the shadows. Suddenly, the old woman's warning echoed in his mind. Try not to leave after dark. He turned to run back inside, but the door slammed shut before he could reach it. The knob wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the door, shouting for help. The rain lashed at him, and through the downpour, he heard something else. Faint footsteps, soft but growing closer. He whipped around, searching the darkness, but he saw nothing, only the empty lot. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like something stalking him. He backed against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide as he searched the shadows. And then, from the far corner of the lot, he saw movement. A figure, hunched and shambling, emerged from the darkness. Its limbs were long and twisted, its skin pale and wet, as though it had crawled out of the earth. Its eyes glowed faintly in the storm, fixed on him. It was coming closer. Adam's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The thing was almost on him now, its distorted face split by a grotesque grin. It reached out, its long fingers grasping for him. Suddenly, the door behind him flew open, and he stumbled backward into the room. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his chest heaving. He pressed his back against the door, listening, waiting for the thing to bang on it, to try to force its way in. But there was only silence. After several long minutes, Adam dared to move. He crept toward the window, peeking through the curtain. The lot was empty. Whatever had been out there was gone. But then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw it. Behind him, in the corner of the room, the twisted, grinning figure. It had already gotten in. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a barren expanse of sand and rock bathed in the pale light of the moon. Jessica squinted at the horizon, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Her car had died hours ago, miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no passing cars, just silence and the unrelenting wind. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking along the deserted highway, her feet dragging with each step, when she saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. A motel, isolated and alone, its sign glowing faintly. The Hollow Pines Motel. It seemed out of place, a strange oasis in the middle of nowhere. Jessica quickened her pace, relief washing over her, a place to rest, a phone, maybe someone who could help. As she approached, she saw that the motel was small, with only a handful of rooms and a single light on in the office. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. Behind the counter sat a man, his back hunched, his face hidden in the shadows. His hands, thin and bony, were folded neatly on the counter in front of him. "Need a room?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it had a strange weight to it, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Yes, please," Jessica said, her voice cracking from thirst. "And is there any chance you have a phone I could use? My car broke down a few miles back, and I don't have any signal." The man didn't respond at first. He just stared at her, his face still obscured by the shadow cast by the dim light above him. Then slowly he reached under the counter and pulled out an old-fashioned key with a heavy brass tag that read Room 7. "Room's in the back," he said, his words deliberate, as if each one carried a warning. "Phone's down. Storm knocked out the lines." Jessica glanced outside. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. She hesitated, but exhaustion weighed her down, making it hard to think clearly. She needed sleep. She'd deal with everything else in the morning. "Thanks," she muttered, taking the key. As she left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man's eyes were still on her, watching her every step. She hurried to Room 7, the furthest room from the office, tucked away in the shadows of the motel's crumbling walls. The room was small and bare, just a bed, a nightstand, and a chair by the window. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled of dampness. A strange feeling of unease settled over her, but she was too tired to care. She locked the door, tossed her bag on the floor, and collapsed onto the bed. As soon as her head hit the pillow, she heard it, a faint scratching sound. She sat up, her heart pounding. The noise was coming from the wall, soft at first, like nails lightly scraping against wood. She shook her head. Just rats. Old motels like this were bound to have vermin. She lay back down, pulling the thin blanket over her, trying to ignore it. But the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to get through the wall. Jessica's breath quickened. She sat up again, her eyes darting around the room. The scratching stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against her chest. She waited, ears straining, listening for any sign of movement. Then, from the corner of the room, she heard a faint whisper. "Let me out." Her heart stuttered in her chest. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the small closet in the corner. The door was closed, but the whisper had come from inside. She stared at it, her skin prickling with fear. "Let me out, please." Jessica's hands trembled. She stood, inching toward the door, her legs weak beneath her. Slowly, she reached for the closet knob, her breath shallow and rapid. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to run, but something else pulled her forward. She yanked the door open. The closet was empty. Nothing but dust and shadows. She let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at herself. She was overtired, her mind playing tricks on her. She needed sleep. That was all. But as she turned to close the closet door, she saw it. A small crack in the back wall, barely noticeable, just wide enough to slip a hand through. And from that crack, a cold, wet breeze blew into the room. Jessica stepped closer, peering into the darkness of the crack. She squinted, trying to see what was on the other side, but it was too dark, too deep. Then, out of the blackness, something moved. A hand. Pale and skeletal, its long, thin fingers curled around the edge of the crack, pulling at the wall, as if trying to widen the gap. Jessica stumbled backward, her heart racing. She slammed the closet door shut and backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For a long moment, there was silence. Then from behind the door, the whisper came again. "Let me out." Jessica grabbed her bag and bolted for the door. She flung it open, stepping out into the cool night air, her skin crawling. She rushed toward the office, her feet splashing in the puddles left from the earlier rainstorm. The lights in the office were off. She banged on the door, shouting for the man at the front desk. But there was no answer. The motel seemed darker now, the moon hidden behind clouds that had rolled in without her noticing. The wind howled through the desert, carrying with it the soft, echoing whisper. "Let me out." Jessica's heart pounded as she turned back toward room 7. The door was still open, the light from the room spilling out onto the pavement. But now, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, its body impossibly thin, its arms long and crooked, stretching down to the floor. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes were glowing, 2 pinpoints of pale light fixed on her. The figure's head tilted to the side, as if curious, as if watching her with something like hunger. Slowly, it stepped forward, its long fingers scraping against the doorframe as it moved. Jessica's legs refused to work. She was frozen, paralyzed with fear, as the thing from the room took another step and another, its long arms reaching out toward her. Then, just as the figure was about to cross the threshold into the night, it stopped. The light from the room flickered, and the figure recoiled, retreating back into the darkness. The door to room 7 slammed shut with a deafening bang, cutting off the light and leaving Jessica alone in the moonlit parking lot. She stood there, trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned and ran, not daring to look back. The desert stretched out before her, vast and empty, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she heard the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. "Let me out." It followed her, growing fainter and fainter until the night swallowed it whole. The wind howled through the dense forest as Martin drove down the winding mountain road. His GPS had been glitching for the past hour, recalculating endlessly, and now it had gone dark. The headlights of his car barely cut through the thick fog that seemed to cling to the road like a living thing. It was supposed to be a short drive to his cousin's cabin, but now, well past midnight, he had no idea where he was. Just as panic started to set in, Martin saw a sign ahead. The wooden letters, barely legible through the mist, read, Pine Creek Lodge, vacancies available. A small motel, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees, appeared a few yards down the road. He felt an immediate sense of unease, but told himself it was the fatigue. He needed a place to sleep, and this was the only option for miles. The parking lot was empty as he pulled in. The building itself looked old, with paint peeling off the walls and a flickering neon sign above the front office. He hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car, the cold mountain air biting at his skin. Inside the office, the atmosphere was no better. It was dimly lit, and the air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic. The counter was empty, and an old, dusty bell sat on it. Martin rang it, and the sound seemed to echo far too long in the small space. After what felt like an eternity, a man appeared from a door behind the counter. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a tight-lipped smile that didn't seem to fit his face. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Yeah," Martin replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "Just for the night." The man nodded slowly, sliding a yellowed guest book across the counter. "Sign here." His long fingers pointed to a blank line, and Martin scribbled his name without much thought. The man handed him a key, numbered 4, and his hand lingered just a second too long before pulling away. "Room's in the back," the man said, his smile never wavering. "Enjoy your stay." Martin thanked him and hurried out, eager to get to his room and shake off the strange vibe. Room 4 was at the far end of the motel, partially hidden by the shadow of a massive pine tree. The room itself was basic: an old bed, a small TV, and a nightstand with a flickering lamp. It smelled faintly of damp wood and something sour, but Martin was too tired to care. He locked the door behind him and collapsed onto the bed. The exhaustion hit him hard, and within minutes he was drifting off to sleep. But just as his mind began to fade into unconsciousness, a sound jolted him awake. A slow, rhythmic, thumping noise. He sat up, blinking in the darkness. At first, he thought it was the sound of the wind outside, but as he listened, the noise grew louder. It was coming from the room next door. It was soft at first, like someone tapping lightly on the wall, but soon it turned into a heavy, insistent pounding. Martin groaned. It was late, and the last thing he needed was some rude guest making noise in the middle of the night. He grabbed his phone to check the time, but the screen was black. Dead battery. The pounding grew louder, more frantic, as if someone was trying to break through the wall. Martin got out of bed, annoyed now, and walked to the door. He stepped outside, the night air colder than before. He made his way toward the room next door, room 3, but stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the door. It was wide open. The darkness inside was impenetrable, but the pounding had stopped the moment he stepped outside. Martin swallowed hard, his earlier frustration now turning into something darker, something like fear. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the open doorway, debating whether or not to call out. Maybe someone needed help, he thought. Or maybe it was just his imagination. He cursed under his breath and walked closer. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is everything okay?" No response. Just silence. Martin stepped into the doorway, peering inside. The room was completely empty. No bags, no signs of life. The bed was untouched, and there was a thin layer of dust on the furniture as if no one had been there for months. But that didn't make sense. The pounding had been real. He heard it. Before he could process what was happening, a cold breeze blew through the room, slamming the door behind him with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Martin spun around, grabbing the door handle to leave, but it wouldn't budge. His heart pounded in his chest as he yanked at the door, but it remained stubbornly shut. He could hear his own breathing now, fast and panicked. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Movement. Slowly, Martin turned to face the far wall. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadow. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there. Tall, impossibly thin, and moving toward him. He froze, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet refused to move. The shadow crept closer, shifting in and out of the flickering light, its form unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. As it neared, Martin saw its face, if you could call it that. It was featureless, just smooth, dark skin stretched over a skeletal frame, with hollow, empty pits where eyes should have been. It reached out toward him, long fingers stretching impossibly wide, and in that moment, Martin's paralysis broke. He lunged for the window, desperate to escape, but as he threw it open, a gust of freezing wind knocked him backward. The shadow was almost upon him now, its presence suffocating, pressing the air from his lungs. He scrambled to his feet and rushed toward the door again, pounding on it with all his strength. "Let me out!" he screamed, his voice cracking with terror. The pounding on the wall started again, louder this time. But it wasn't just from room 3. It was coming from all around him, like a dozen fists hammering at the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The whole room seemed to tremble under the assault. Just as Martin's panic reached its peak, the door to room 4 flew open, and he stumbled out into the night. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He ran. His legs pumped furiously as he sprinted across the parking lot, not daring to look back. The wind howled around him, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard something else, whispers, faint and chilling, carried on the night air. He reached his car, fumbling with the keys as he threw himself inside. The engine sputtered to life, and he floored it, tearing out of the lot as fast as he could. His hands were shaking, his heart racing, but he didn't dare slow down. As the motel disappeared in the rearview mirror, Martin glanced back one last time. The sign above the office flickered, casting eerie shadows over the building. And standing in the doorway of room 4 was the figure, watching him, its hollow eyes following his car as it disappeared into the fog. Martin drove through the night, not stopping until the sun began to rise, far away from the mountain road. But even then, even in the light of day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, something that didn't want him to leave. It was just supposed to be one night. A quick stopover at a roadside motel in the middle of nowhere before continuing the long drive the next morning. Natalie had been on the road for hours, her back aching, eyes burning from the dim glow of headlights against the empty stretch of highway. So when she saw the flickering neon sign reading "The Driftwood Motel" in the distance, she didn't think twice about pulling in. The motel was shabby, its paint peeling and windows dark. A gust of wind blew dry leaves across the empty parking lot. As she stepped out of her car, the chill of the night making her shiver. There were no other cars parked outside, no sounds except the whistle of wind through the trees. But it was late, and she was too tired to care. Inside the office, the air was stale and thick with the smell of something faintly metallic. A bell sat on the counter, and as Natalie rang it, the chime echoed unnaturally loud. She waited for several minutes before a figure emerged from the back. The motel owner was an older woman, her graying hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face deeply lined, as though worn down by years of something Natalie couldn't quite place. Her eyes were too wide, too alert for someone running a dying roadside motel at this hour. "You need a room, dear?" The woman's voice was raspy, each word slow and deliberate. "Yes, please. Just for tonight." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've got one room left. Room 10. You'll be comfortable there." There was something off about the way she said it, but Natalie chalked it up to the hour. She signed the guest book, noticing how few names there were in it. None recent. The woman handed her a brass key and gestured to the far end of the parking lot. Natalie hurried outside, eager to get to her room. The motel stretched out in a single row, each door identical except for the tarnished numbers nailed into them. Room 10 was at the very end, almost hidden by the shadows cast by the surrounding trees. As she approached, the wind picked up, rustling the branches in an almost whispering way. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the light. The room was sparse. A single bed with a worn comforter, a small nightstand, and a mirror hanging crookedly on the opposite wall. The wallpaper was faded, curling at the edges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, it was better than sleeping in her car. Natalie threw her bag on the bed and went to lock the door. As she turned the deadbolt, a strange chill ran down her spine. For a second, she could have sworn she heard something, a faint rhythmic tapping like nails against wood. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. Silence. Probably just the wind. Shaking off the unease, she sat on the bed and checked her phone. No service, as expected. She sighed and tossed it aside, feeling a headache coming on. She needed sleep. The tapping started again. This time it was louder, more distinct. Natalie's eyes flicked toward the door, but the sound was coming from outside. It was coming from the wall. She stood slowly, her heart starting to race as she pressed her hand against the wall next to the bed. The tapping stopped. She waited, her breath shallow, fingers trembling slightly against the old wallpaper. Just when she was about to pull away, it started again, directly beneath her fingertips. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel it. Something was tapping from inside the wall, slow and deliberate, like it was trying to get her attention. She backed away, suddenly feeling trapped in the small, dingy room. Her eyes darted around, looking for any explanation, but there was none. The air felt heavier now, thicker, and the temperature seemed to drop. A creaking sound echoed from the ceiling. Her gaze shot up to the old wooden beams above. Something shifted. Slowly, painfully slowly, the light bulb flickered, casting the room in a dim, wavering glow. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that didn't quite make sense. The tapping grew louder. Natalie's chest tightened. She grabbed her phone, desperate for any kind of connection, but the screen was blank. No service. She was on her own. She stared at the door, wondering if she should just leave, just get back in the car and drive through the night, but something in the air held her in place. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving behind an unsettling silence that felt too thick, too present. Then, from the corner of the room, came a faint, scratching sound. It was so soft at first, Natalie almost convinced herself it wasn't real. But as she stood there, frozen, it grew louder, more insistent, as if something was inside the walls, clawing its way out. Her eyes darted toward the mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed. The glass was cloudy, smudged with fingerprints and grime, but she could see her reflection clearly enough. And then, something moved behind her. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone, or something, but the room was empty. The door was still locked. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts now, her pulse hammering in her ears. She looked back at the mirror, her heart nearly stopping. There, in the reflection, standing just behind her, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long, too thin. Its face was obscured in the flickering light, but she could make out its eyes, hollow, black voids staring directly at her. Her blood ran cold. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her in the mirror, its head slowly tilting to one side as though curious. Natalie whipped around, expecting it to be right there behind her. But there was nothing. The room was empty. Her chest tightened with terror, but the figure, the thing, was still in the mirror, standing in the same place, its gaze fixed on her. She backed away, trying to keep her eyes on both the room and the reflection, but her movements felt sluggish, like something was pressing down on her. She couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe. The scratching in the walls returned, louder now, as if something was clawing at the very structure of the motel. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror moved. It took a step forward, then another. Natalie's eyes widened in horror. It was getting closer, closer to the edge of the mirror, closer to stepping out. She stumbled backward, her mind racing, her pulse deafening in her ears. Just as the figure was about to reach the edge of the mirror, she bolted. She lunged for the door, fumbled with the lock, and yanked it open. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. She ran to her car, her hands shaking so violently that she dropped the keys twice before finally getting the door open. As she sped out of the parking lot, her heart hammering in her chest, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel was still there, dark and silent, but standing in the doorway of room 10 was the figure, watching. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow her as she drove away, disappearing into the fog. Natalie didn't stop driving until she was miles down the road, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, the faint scratching sound still echoing in her mind. She never spoke of that night again. But sometimes when she was alone in the dark, she could still feel it. The cold gaze of something watching her, waiting, just beyond the edge of the mirror.